All right, I'm going to go ahead because we want to save our time with our speaker today. I am the co-director of the Women in Public Policy Program, Hannah Riley Bowles, along with Iris, my co-director, Iris Bonet. We're thrilled to have you join us for our fall Women in Public Policy Program research seminar. This fall, our series is centered on exploring work and family. So we are we'll give you all an opportunity to look on or to understand better how research has evolved on the relationship between work and family, including how institutions, policies, and social norms shape our, how we navigate that boundary. Today, I am so thrilled that we have such a path-breaking, thought-leading scholar with us to launch the seminar. Professor Nancy Folbre will be presenting on making care work, why our economy should put people first. Nancy Folbre is Professor Emerita of Economics and Director of the Program on Gender and Care Work at the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She is also a senior fellow of the Levi Economics Institute at Bard College. Professor Folbre's research explores the interface between political economy and feminist theory, with a particular emphasis on the value of unpaid care work. Though, as we're going to hear today, from her seminar presentation, she is going to talk also not only how she has illuminated the value and the importance of capturing the value created by unpaid care work. She also looks at how paid care work has been potentially undervalued within our society. Today, she's going to outline the history of feminist efforts to assert the economics importance of unpaid care work in the U.S. and explain why both paid and unpaid care work remain undervalued in our national income accounts. She will present for about 30 minutes. She's going to provide this historic overview. She's going to open things up. We'll have an opportunity for conversation. And then we're really hoping that to get her back in to present a little longer on a new book that's coming out shortly. So we're going to get an opportunity to learn from whence she's coming intellectually and then where she's headed now this fall with this new book project. So if you have questions, we'll ask you to raise your virtual hand or put your question in the chat, and we'll look for opportunities to bring people in to ask their questions live if they can, or otherwise we'll read out your questions and so you can hear the presenter's response. And so, Nancy, can I turn it over to you? Thank you so much again for it. Please join me in a virtual applause welcoming our speaker.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I'm really happy to be here and really eager to have some questions and comments and interaction with all of you all. I just put together a new website called carethink.org, and it has a lot of resources on it that you might find useful, kind of as elaborations of what I have to say and get a sense of where I'm going. I'm trying to take some of my PowerPoints and kind of distill them into something that is actually kind of a standalone big picture of what I'm trying to do. So let me just forge ahead. When I started out on this line of research, I was very focused on numbers and on accounting for care, ways of measuring and valuing unpaid work, and ways of thinking about the undervaluation of paid care work. But accounting is, as this quote from Jane Gleason White indicates, it's actually a pretty subjective and literary exercise. A story is also an account, and all accounts have a kind of story in them. And a lot of what I'm reaching for is a kind of an account of the way that economists haven't thought carefully enough about the process of caring for other people. So there's a famous quote from Adam Smith that I'm sure all of you have heard, and you've probably also heard the kind of feminist gloss on it. So Smith, in making a case for the importance of economic self-interest, really emphasized that it wasn't benevolence that got the butcher and the brewer and the baker to provide their goods uh, for that enabled us to get our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. And I think, what's really transparent in the quote from a modern vantage point is that he's kind of ignoring the fact that women were the ones who actually got dinner on the table, and that his mother, in particular, uh, was cooking his. So it, I think Smith still kind of invites us to think about the invisible heart of the economy because he's, even though he's emphasizing the pursuit of self-interest, he's also insisting that moral sentiments are really pretty crucial to the successful functioning of a market. And that's a place where I really agree with Smith. And, like Smith, I think that human motivation has a lot of unintended consequences. In his view, the unintended consequence of the pursuit of self-interest was economic growth. And I think that's a partial truth. But it's also true that an unintended consequence of taking care of family members and neighbors and friends is really significant benefits for society as a whole, for the economy as a whole, and that it's something that we really need to understand in order to have a better picture of sustainable economic growth. So I wrote a book in 2001 called The Invisible Heart, and it's basically kind of laid out this argument that the invisible heart is just as important to the economy as the invisible hand. And pretty much all I've been doing in the ensuing 25 years has been trying to kind of give this argument more heft and more weight and persuade more economists to pay attention to it. And economists are really my primary audience here because I think they play a really important role in shaping social policy. And they've developed a kind of economic vocabulary that often defines the terms of current policy debates. So here are the questions I just want to very briefly answer in this overview. And then, as Hannah indicated, we'll take a little pause and see if we want to have some back and forth before I continue. So first question, why should we care about this thing called care? Secondly, what do we mean by it? How should we define it? Um, how does it fit with some other related concepts? Uh, what are its distinctive features? Why does it differ in ways that matter for our understanding of the economy? And then finally, why is it undervalued? So the why is just that concern for others is obviously crucial to biological reproduction, but it's also crucial to social reproduction. That is the process of keeping human society going and being concerned about the future. And one of the biggest limitations of the market as a vehicle for the allocation of resources is that future generations aren't represented in it. They're not represented in the market. They're not consumers. They're not represented in the polity. They're not voters. And so our feelings of concern or commitment to their well-being are really important to the sustainability of the human project. And I think this is a reason why you'll see that my analysis of care work has a lot in common with ecological economics and issues of concern for the physical, the natural environment. Uh, and I think the parallels are really striking. Care provision, like natural assets, like ecological assets, like clean air, water, natural resources, it's essentially subsidizing the market economy. It's a really important input into it. And it's very much affected by the outputs of the market economy in some good ways and some not so good ways. But it's also really important to remember that the distribution of the costs of care, like the distribution of the costs of environmental degradation, is a site of a lot of collective conflict. There's a lot of disagreement. It has very different effects on different groups within our society. And there's a lot of negotiation and bargaining taking place all the time about what it means and how it should be, who should be paying for it and who's getting what from it. So I'm going to embrace a very broad definition of care provision as the production and the development and the maintenance of human capabilities. And I'm sure you'll recognize that that is um, very similar to a definition of human capital, the way some economists use the term human capital very, very broadly. But the textbook version of human capital is pretty narrow. It's basically capabilities that have a rate of return in the market. And often human capital is actually measured in terms of the present discounted value of future earnings. So it's a very market-centric approach. And capabilities, I think, it includes human capital, but it also includes our capability for taking care of each other and for taking care of the natural environment and for cooperating with one another in providing for and protecting um, goods and services that can't necessarily be produced through the market. And it's a very expensive process. It takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of time, and it also takes some commitment to the well-being of others. Um, so I want to really urge you to think about um, care provision, not just in terms of love or altruism, but also in terms of money and self-interest. It's a pretty complicated mix of the two. We all want to do well, but we also all want to do good, and sometimes there's some tension between doing well and doing good. And that's kind of a key aspect of understanding the complexity of the care economy. So just to be more specific about this, care work can be unpaid or paid, um, defining it in terms of its particular output of human capabilities, rather than whether it's market or non-market. We want to really emphasize care work, but we also want to recognize that money and expenditures of money are also part of the process of providing care. And care expenditures, which we could think of as investments in human capability, can also be private or public. And there's a lot of debate over to what extent we want to allocate um, our resources between the private and the public. So some forms of care work, the kinds of, I think, that get a lot of attention, especially in qualitative research, are especially relational, or sometimes referred to as nurturant care. That is what we think of as face-to-face, on a first name basis, often touching, often physical, often um, uh, kind of taking place over a longer period of time than in what we think of as kind of a spot market. But other forms of care are kind of indirect, like just maintaining the care environment and facilitating relational or nurturant care. So, we have a lot of private spaces. We have a lot of private services that involve kind of dealing with bodily functions, reproductive care, and just this space is also kind of a part of the care economy that requires maintenance in order to uh, relational or nurturant care to take place. And the complementarities between these two are really really bear a closer consideration. So economists often talk about the service sector and contrast the service sector with the manufacturing sector of the economy. But the service sector is a really big category. It's very heterogeneous. It includes retail services, it includes business services, it includes care services. And I'm really emphasizing care services, which are categorized in our economic accounting system largely in terms of three industries: health, care, education, and social services. But there are also some care occupations outside of those industries, and one of those is domestic service. So I think we want to look at both occupations and industries when thinking about paid work, but then we want to add in to the care sector the unpaid production and development and maintenance of human capabilities in families and communities, and to understand that there are important complementarities between paid and unpaid care. So just looking at paid care work in the US, about 37% of all employed women are working in these three industries compared to about 12% of employed men. So we hear a lot about occupational segregation of women, but women are also really segregated by industry. And as a result, a lot of people in what we think of as non-care occupations, like managers and professionals, are actually working in the care sector because they're managing uh, care services in care industries. And another really important feature of paid care work in the US is that immigrants and people of color are very much overrepresented in low-wage care work in particular. And care work has both kind of a high end and a low end. Some of it's very requires a lot of educational credentials, and some of it is at the other extreme, and some of it's really in the middle. Like we think of teaching and nursing as kind of middle class occupations in which a lot of college educated women work, and the pay and remuneration in those occupations is really important for understanding the overall um, inequality in pay by gender. So turning to unpaid care and thinking about how big that is, well, a really surprising feature of our economy is that about half of all of the work that we do is unpaid work. And by work, I'm adopting the kind of conventional definition in time use surveys, which is it's an activity that you could, in principle, pay other people to do. That's um, a definitional um, agreement, very common in time use research, not really the same as the way a lot of economists would define work as something that creates disutility, that you only engage in work in order to get money. And so since you're engaging in unpaid work for reasons that don't have to do with money, then maybe it shouldn't be considered work because you must be doing it because you get some intrinsic satisfaction from it. And it's that the history of that kind of motivational distinction in economics goes a long way towards explaining why economists uh, have a hard time conceptualizing um, the real importance, the nature of unpaid care work. Um, so a lot of um, unpaid care work is structured around the needs of dependents, children and the elderly. Not all of it. I think all of us engage in some self-care activities, and there's a lot of reciprocity between adults and sometimes extreme inequality between adults in terms of the process of providing care. And we all know that care work is predominantly, but not exclusively, provided by women. uh, Men do a fair amount. So what's different about care work? What is it that makes me want to kind of um, single it out for some special attention here? Well, when economists talk about the market, they often assume that consumers have something called consumer sovereignty. That is, they're rational consumers. They have the information they need. They're capable of defending their own interests. If a service isn't meeting their need, they can go and find another one because in a competitive economy, there are perfect substitutes by assumption that allow consumers to be king, as it were. And of course, that's an overstatement of the way the market works, even for consenting adults. But it's especially misleading when you think about children or the elderly who often literally lack the ability to choose their caregivers. And even the economic structure of payment in a lot of care services shows you why consumers are often very limited in their choices. So, third-party payment, whether it's coming through the state or through private insurance, reducing our ability to choose our doctors or to choose our therapists because they may be in our network or out of their network. But also, a lot of care provision kind of involves team production, collaborating with other workers, other fellow teachers. Teachers are kind of um, working with other teachers and collaborating with students. Students themselves have to put out some effort in order to make teachers successful. Doctors rely on some collaboration from their patients. People have to follow directions, take care of themselves, uh, take their medication, so forth and so on. So the productivity of a worker in care services is more affected by the characteristics of the consumer than a standardized commodity like a Coca-Cola or a gallon of gas. And then we also know, just from our own personal experience, that motivation and continuity of relationships are very likely to affect care quality. And that is something that is limiting substitutability. Like you have a relationship with a doctor, so you may not be completely satisfied with the care you're getting, but you feel like they know you and that continuity is worth something, et cetera, et cetera. Likewise with a lot of other care relationships, including those within a family, that really what we value about family relationships is that they aspire to a continuity and a commitment that is very special and has implications for what people get out of it, as it were. So a lot of specific points flow from these general observations about the nature of care. It's very labor intensive. It's somewhat resistant to technological change, not completely, but more than a lot of other activities. Um, even like dealing with a phone tree for customer service is a lot less satisfying than actually talking to an on-call nurse about your feeling and why you're feeling bad and what you might do about it. It's really difficult to measure the inputs and the outputs, uh, the value added of care provision. So, a teacher, well, you can pretend to measure the success of a teacher by students' performance on standardized exams, but in many ways, the value of what a teacher produces is played out over a process of many years and many different complex tasks. Um, so the paying for performance in the care sector is very difficult precisely because of the complexity and the time scale of uh, contributions to the development of human capabilities. And then there are really big public good effects, positive externalities or spillover effects. And here again, you see the kind of parallel with the natural environment, where just a lot of unanticipated effects of care provision can be both, well, if it's really good care provision, we expect it to have positive externalities. If it's very poor care provision, we expect it to have negative social impacts. And so this research area really overlaps very strongly with research on social capital, on levels of trust and cooperation. I prefer the term social climate to social capital because I think to call it capital implies that it's somehow, really fungible and can be put in the bank. I think it's actually something less tangible um, and harder to capture than that. And I think, the unpredictability that we feel now about our actual natural climate is very much akin to our growing concerns about the social climate, that it's heating up in ways that are very confusing and very threatening. And I think some of that has to do with our neglect of the care economy. So I actually have a whole separate PowerPoint of advertisements from businesses promising to provide really good care. Um, and in fact, a lot of customer service departments are now called customer care departments. And as an economist, I guess I like this point because what it shows is that businesses know that people actually want care. They want to be cared for. They want some assurances of something more than an impersonal exchange. Um, but of course, the dilemma for a lot of care consumers is it's pretty hard to judge the quality of a service in advance. And we see a lot of cheap talk about care. So So we see sort of care washing as an analog to greenwashing. That is promises of really good care, like promises of like a really good impact on the environment. Um, uh, Toyota Care, Honda Care, airline care. It's a really interesting and very expansive uh, phenomenon. So, if it's so important and it's so valuable, why is it actually undervalued? Well, uh, this is a really big and a really important question. And the first and most important part of the question is that women's opportunities to specialize in anything but care provision were historically very restricted. And that in turn restricted their ability to affect the discourse of the economy and the categories of productivity and income and economic welfare. And it became just very easy to take care for granted. And a lot of that kind of path dependent effect we're still dealing with today. And it's really apparent in the way that people still continue to define work as paid work and never um, acknowledge the fact that we should also be thinking about the supply of unpaid work and the productivity of unpaid care and the output of services that are not being provided for money, which are really important um, for our economic well-being. But there is another reason that compounds this historical reluctance to recognize the value of unpaid work in particular, and that is it's very hard to measure the individual uh, output or to capture the individual value of care provision. And so the public good and externality aspects of it, I think, are in a really contribute to its undervaluation, especially in a market-centric economy where some activities are very richly rewarded and others go completely unrewarded or unnoticed. So I think a really important point um, in understanding the devaluation of care is that care itself, a commitment to care, the provision of care itself tends to reduce bargaining power. And the reason is that bargaining power is premised on withholding something until you get what you want from it. And if care is motivated by concern for the well-being of another person, that is not a viable threat. So this is sometimes referred to, I think, in a phrase from an old rock and roll song as a prisoner of love effect. And I think everybody knows the feeling of being kind of a little bit trapped by a commitment that feels really good and really important and in some ways really sacred, but is nonetheless very costly. And, the basic problem that care providers face is that it imposes very private costs and it yields very public benefits that are that are, that are at least as important as the private benefits that somebody derives from the intrinsic satisfaction of providing that care. So we don't want to belie the intrinsic motivation or or we don't want to kind of disrespect that intrinsic motivation. Just want to explain why some forms of intrinsic motivation are really costly and others are not. So just a very quick review of care penalties. And again, there's some references to more, quantitative analysis on my website in uh, journal articles and books. But just a very quick overview. Time devoted to unpaid care work lowers lifetime earnings and increases the risk of poverty, and it accounts for a lot of the inequality that we still see in women's earnings relative to men. We also know that discrimination against women, and particularly against mothers, is still a very real phenomenon. And I think the audit experiments that reveal discrimination against mothers are very, very telling. Just a subtle cue on a resume that someone is a parent uh, tends to send them to the bottom of the pile in terms of interviews and callbacks. And Um, it's an example of a kind of randomized experiment that really shows, really reveals a very explicit form of discrimination. But it's also true that just econometric analysis shows that women and men in care industries and occupations are paid significantly less than others with the same education and experience. So there's actually an industry penalty and an occupation penalty for being in paid care work, um, especially comparing jobs in business services with jobs in care services. And both of those industrial categories are categorized by pretty high levels of education. So who's benefiting from this care provision? Well, obviously, dependents really benefit. Children, sick or disabled people, and the frail elderly benefit from a reliable source of care. And I think that's a really big reason why a lot of debates over care policy are kind of fraught, is that the possibility that um, women might be less willing to sacrifice their own economic well-being to provide dependent care uh, is really unnerving, not only for dependents but also for those who care about dependents. And this is exactly why having a really positive vision of alternative and more equitable forms of care provision is really, really important. So it's pretty clear that employers benefit because they don't pay the full cost of producing and maintaining those capabilities, that labor power, as it were. Um, and I don't know, one place you could see this in current debates is like employers demanding that workers not work from home. Here you have um, an option for a lot of workers, for mothers of young children in particular, that's pretty efficient from a social point of view. It reduces commuting time. It makes it easier to combine paid work and family. Um, a lot of research shows it's not very costly for employers in many, many cases. And yet employers don't, are really pushing back against work from home um, these days because it imposes some inconveniences and costs that they don't really want to pay and they don't have to pay given current uh, institutional arrangements. So it's also true that other empowered groups are able to shift costs onto disempowered groups like low-wage immigrants. And it's also true that men benefit economically at home and at work because women are paying a larger share of the costs. So who's harmed? Other than obviously people who are not getting adequate care and women who are economically impoverished by their commitments to care provision. But it's also true that the deterioration of the social climate that results is very costly for everyone. And I think we could do a better job quantifying the social costs that are related to inequality and poverty and economic stress, including what we've come to call deaths of despair, to really show why effective and sustainable care provision pays off by enhancing trust and cooperation, ability to solve coordination and public goods problems. And in fact, it's probably a prerequisite for really dealing effectively with climate change. So over and over again in the business press and in fact in the everyday news, you'll see this tremendous emphasis on growth and gross domestic product, on whether the economy is getting bigger or not, and whether its growth in the future is threatened. But it's such a misleading measure of success. There are many things that increase gross domestic product that are social bads. Um, Income from gross domestic product is very unequally distributed. A lot of workers are not earning a living wage, much less a kind of caring wage sufficient to support um, people who need special assistance. People who care for their family or friends and neighbors instead of paying for care are actually lowering gross domestic product. There's a really big and fascinating literature on how breastfeeding lowers gross domestic product because people spend less money on infant formula. That's a very telling example of a very uh, very pernicious kind of application of market logic. We don't really count investment in people as investment. We treat spending on children as consumption, even though economists talk all the time about investment in human capital. But generally, what they're talking about is expenditures on education. They're not talking about expenditures on creating the little, you know, the little human beings um, that are necessary to absorb that education. Private and public spending on health and education, also, it's valued only by the cost of providing it, not by the value of what is provided. There's a tremendous bias against recognition of the value of care provision. So by definition, it doesn't yield a surplus because the market value is set equal to market price. So it's unproductive because we're just valuing it what we spend on it and not on the value of what we get from it. So, back in the days of the Roman Empire, a man named Cicero declared that the good of the people should be the supreme law. And I learned this, and I learned the Latin for this expression, salus populi, because I went to give a talk at Yale that was sponsored by a group of undergraduate econ majors who were tired of being primed for jobs in investment banking and wanted to get together and talk about uh, uh, kinds of economic theory that might actually be aimed at improving well-being. And I was very heartened by talking with them and being with them. And so I have adopted this Latin saying as my personal slogan. And here's where I'm going to pause and hope that you have some comments or questions before I keep blabbering myself.
It's a great place, particularly at the Harvard Kennedy School, to pause a slide. I think I think we'd like to think that is a question. Not that we know that phrase, but that's a deeply resonant question.